listeners and indeed viewers, and welcome to episode 3, or in fact the third episode of the new, it's a podcast where we talk to financial experts, mobility experts, transport experts, and talk about how the new future is shaping up in terms of finance and the economy. Now, for those of you who listened or watched indeed the first 2 episodes, are now wondering why this is episode 2. Very briefly, we decided episodes 1 and 2 were basically one long episode of the same subject with the same speakers, so that is now 1A and 1B. So this, despite the fact that it's the third episode, this is episode 2A. So sorry to the people at Spotify, Apple and SoundCloud, it's confusing the hell out of them, but this is the third episode. Anyway, right, my name's Kevin Morris. I am the host for this series of podcasts, and I'll introduce now to our guest, our first guest. He was previously the Corporate Development Director for DERA, which is the UK Ministry of Defence's its Defence Evaluation Research Agency. He is currently the Sheriff of London. He was the founder, or he's the founder of ZEM, who's London's leading commercial think tank, and he is the founder of, oh God, I'll recut that. Okay, we'll cut there, sorry. And he's also the founder of the Long Finance Initiative and the Global Green Finance Index. Please welcome Professor Michael Mainelli. Michael, thank you.
Hello, good to be here.
Well, thank you very much for your time. Our second guest is Rory Sutherland, who's on the first episodes as well. Rory is the Vice Chairman of Over the UK. Rory, hello again.
Hello, it's great to be back.
Well, thank you for coming back. And my usual cohort in these podcasts, Eric Masaba, the founder of TEXI, the Transit Exchange for the 21st Century, and also the man credited with inventing, if you like, the whole concept of ride-hailing and ride-sharing. This is very true. Some people are saying, is that true? Surely that was Uber. It's not. It's Eric. It's the person you're going to hear from now. So, with all that put aside, what we're looking at today
Thank you.
is it's the
Thank
new...
you so much, Kevin.
Well, no, it's true, isn't it? I'm not making this up. So, all of our episodes are called The New with ellipses, and this is the new finance and the new transit exchange. The point we're looking at is when you monetize the road spectrum, you suddenly have trillions to play with, trillions to spend. So here are the questions we're going to cover. What new financing options best serve a low carbon sustainable future for our roads and our transit systems? Can any of these ideas be exported to help the UK transition to a more sustainable future without impoverishing other countries, other nations? And how do automakers, who of course are a major source of employment for many, many countries, navigate this new reality? Now then, that's a lot of stuff to take in. I'm going to start with Rory, because you look very keen to jump in there. Rory,
it's not only automakers. I mean, I suppose it's the entire transportation industry, I think, will be affected by this. I think importantly, first of all, we've just had an interesting experiment in the sense that I think most of us thought, to be honest, going into lockdown, that there would be major logistical breakdowns, okay, in terms of significant food shortages. Yeah. Now, we've had an awful lot of hardship. I certainly don't want to brush over that. But the one dog that didn't bark in the night is that there, apart from having 2 weeks of having to eat my second favorite breakfast cereal, at a point in the lockdown where I thought we'd be down to potatoes, the kind of grocery logistics and the general provision of stuff we need for fairly, enjoyable survival at a material level, not necessarily at a social level, has gone on uninterruptedly. Now, the UK is very good at grocery logistics. It's worth making that point because we are a nation of shopkeepers and we are disproportionately good at that. But what's interesting about it is it's revealed both to the business community and to the public at large how much travel was really deep down discretionary. If you take that question of is your journey really necessary, we all assumed that day trips to Frankfurt to meet Jürgen in a windowless conference room were essential travel. And that's how we viewed it.
Yeah.
And the simple truth is, technologically, that hasn't been true for probably 6 or 7 years. But for some reason, and all manner of network effects slowed it, we kept on behaving in those habitual ways. I think an enormous amount of travel is actually performative. In other words, it's done for the symbolic value of making the journey rather than the necessity of moving your body about. And so I find this period just extraordinary in terms of, had you suggested this experiment, people would have said, no, you couldn't even maintain this for a week.
Yeah.
And yet, bizarrely, large parts of, what you might call, civil and material activity can continue with a vastly reduced level of travel. And along with that, by the way, there is the interesting thing we've been exposed to, which is economics has many, many phrases, and it's added very useful phrases to the language, like, for example, opportunity cost, okay? But economics doesn't have a concept of less is more, does it? It doesn't have any concept. In economics, more is more. And the assumption is that everything that everybody does is utility maximizing. And as a result, that essentially, if you constrain people in some way, their lives will become worse.
Yeah.
Now, I think one of the things I've discovered is that I've made far fewer journeys. I won't be bothering replacing my car for another 3 years because the distance I cover has been a quarter of what it was previously, okay, in simple mileage. One thing to remember, though, the quality of those journeys has been immeasurably better. I drove back home to Wales non-stop. And when I say non-stop, it was not only did I not stop at Lee Delamere or, Heston, I didn't need to stop because I didn't need to take a pee, because at no point had I been forced to be stationary on the southwestern section of the M25. I sailed straight through. Now, one way to sell constraints, rationing or pricing in terms of road use is not only an economic argument, it's a qualitative argument, which is, yes, you will end up traveling less, you'll make fewer journeys, maybe even shorter journeys, but the journeys you do make will be of an inordinately higher quality in terms of just enjoyment, predictability, low variance of journey time, and so forth. So that's also, I think, an interesting question, in that if you went to the public now and said, we're going to ration road use, and you used that argument and you simply said that, look, to be absolutely honest, the worst way to ration the use of a road is people's preparedness to get stuck in a traffic jam, which is how so in a sense, what we're doing is actually prioritizing road use for the people whose journey is least urgent and least necessary, because those are the people who have the highest tolerance of delay.
Yeah.
And so any system of rationing road use, which doesn't have to be financial, has to be better than that.
Yes. Michael?
I'd agree with that.
Eric agrees. Michael, I'll come back to you in a second. Eric, I want to get Michael.
No, I definitely agree with it. I think that what we're seeing is we're bouncing on the trampoline here with COVID. COVID is a great experiment, things we could never have done before. We're getting away with murder in some cases. And what I like about Rory's point is that this experiment has shown some limits as well. It basically says, for those people who are interested in climate change, and I certainly am, having been involved in the sector for well over 40 years, one of my problems is I've been trying to explain to people that behavior won't get you there. Behavioral change won't do it. Yeah. It's important, it's helpful, but COVID basically said, if we just kind of plow on the way we are, but are slightly more climate aware or green aware, we knock 5 or 6% off global emissions, and it's really driven by population. So we need some really deep economic reforms here. And a lot of this, if you're going to change behavior, the example I love to give is that back just after the financial crises, but around 2011, Americans drove 4% fewer miles that year. Any idea why?
2011.
Petrol rose by 32%. And that's inspiring because it says prices will change behavior. Yeah. It had nothing to do with Americans waking up to the Sierra Club's message, and the minute the price dropped, they went back to their usual driving habits. But it also shows you the kind of price changes that are required if you were going to have, say, for example, an 80% drop in that type of mileage. It's not the way that you should run this type of modeling, but you could easily multiply by several factors.
I'm actually going to slightly disagree, because I think that if you define behavioral change broadly, one of the things that has changed is norms. So in the business community, if you were the guy who requested to attend a meeting by video link in January, you were part of the awkward squad. Okay, you're an outlier and an anomaly. And so one force in behavioral change isn't only incentives or even nudging. It's simple social convention. And John Stuart Mill's very good on this, that when he writes on liberty, he isn't only talking about liberty being constrained by government, which is the bit that libertarians always go on about. Our behaviour is to some extent as much constrained by the expectations of others.
Correct. Funnily enough, this is kind of where I was headed, Rory.
Good. Okay. Sorry. In which case, my apologies.
No, I think you're absolutely right to object to that first half on its own. Because where I was headed was, so we've seen this bit where behavior changes in terms of be aware haven't done very much. Okay. They've done very little at all. We've seen that price changes, if they're going to make a difference, are going to be pretty radical. And some of them will have to be. There's no easy out from this. This is major infrastructure changes. The current good example is that the current rate of refurbishing of old buildings in the United Kingdom to meet climate change, we're about 2,000 years away from renovating the existing stock of housing. In other words, they'll have all crumbled into dust. Think Roman ruins. Okay, but back to Rory's point. But what we have also done in this great COVID experiment is we've worked out the limits of existing transportation changes, but as he points out quite rightly, we've changed social norms. So we didn't learn that video conferencing worked. Heck, my firm had video conferencing in the 90s. Skype, I happen to be a big fan of open source, Jitsi, are 2003. So, Microsoft, woke up to it in 2017, but let's not judge technological progress on Microsoft or we'll all be dead. Where I'm headed here is,
we may edit that bit out, but okay, just
you can edit that bit out. That's fine. You can leave it in.
No, I'd like to leave it in. We'll see. We'll check. We'll check out our lawyers.
But let's go back onto this. So what we did learn was, and as Rory points out, mixed mode doesn't work. That was the big thing. Yeah. If everybody is in one thing, that's great. But the minute you start breaking that up, mixed mode doesn't work. But one of the interesting things is now, where does that mixed mode get going? It's when it becomes a real hard social norm. And so I'll give you a positive example where social norming works, and awareness clearly started it. But something much unremarked upon is that business travel, air business travel in Scandinavia dropped 8% last year. 2019, so this had nothing to do with COVID. And why is that? Well, that was Fleegscam, the flight shaming movement. So it's the social norms can do this. And we could see some really interesting social norms where the climate change movement meets the social norm of, hey, buddy, why do you think I'm going to pay for you to fly and see a client when everybody else manages to do it using video conferencing?
Yeah, that's a good point. But Eric, I'm going to come to you because we're going to talk about transit exchange. And I took part in a webinar yesterday with some parking operators from Europe, the city's actual operators themselves. And one of the companies involved, one of the OEMs in the parking sector, said that COVID-19 has actually propelled parking innovation forward by 10 years because they had the chance to do stuff. Cities are open now to innovation, where before it maybe take 5 years for policy to come through. Madrid, for example, Madrid was asking companies, got any good ideas for we can help parking, we can help with public transport, get people back on the roads, get people back in trains and tubes. And they were doing it within 6 weeks. From an idea to actual fruition was 6 weeks rather than 5 years. And the point they're making was that this bizarre situation we're in is kind of gently nudging people towards changing their habits rather than enforcing them to do so. So Eric, as the inventor of the transit exchange, is this the perfect time for your solution then? Therefore, if people are gently nudging towards things and they're more open to change because they've got more, I guess things are changing anyway, and there are people that open their mind a bit to things that are slightly different.
I absolutely agree. In fact, I don't think it's nudging. I think it's more hitting with a sledgehammer. This has been such a monumental shift in all our norms and what but what we think we should do or can do, everything's changed. For example, another interesting thing, British Gas, they come out and service boilers at this time of year. They're now offering people £65 to not have their boiler serviced. They're saying if you really don't need your boiler service, what we can do is free up even more appointments for those who need it, and we'll give you £65 if you delay the servicing of your boiler. Now, they pay fines anyway for not turning up on time for appointments because they overbook, and they pay at least £30, often £90 per person that they missed the appointment for. So they've now figured out a better way of using that sea of appointments that monetize their appointment schedule in a way, is to pay people to say, forgive us for not coming, we'll pay you in advance and we won't come. And this is the same sort of idea. I was talking to a chap in the Netherlands, the Ministry of Transport and Infrastructure, and we were talking about how to slow down or reduce the number of people coming to the city centre. They say they do it all by parking charges in most cities, even in Liverpool. It's very similar. It's so expensive to go and park in, you might as well just take a taxi. It's cheaper to take a taxi there and back than drive in and park for even 3 hours. So that's what people do, and that frees up space. So the simple fact of the matter is, once these social norms are more in line with, it's not weird to not own a car, because most of the time your car is sitting there anyway, unused. Why not hire a car or rent a taxi or get a space in a shed, fleet vehicle for 1 hour, 1 day, 1 week, whatever you need, and the rest of the time you don't have that cost. That's now feasible. Once we also say to governments, especially city and regional governments, you can monetize that road space, which is normally costing you money. Everything changes. Now, in super dense cities like London, I don't know, because the tube system does such a great job, but most cities in most countries, apart from Japan, have very few metro systems. For a country the size of an 80 to 100 million person country, I believe there's only a very small number who have any developed metro systems outside their capital city. I think Japan and Germany, and basically that's about it. You need to go to the really big countries for more. But what we can now do, if London lost, as Michael once told me, London's been the biggest city in the UK for 1,000 years or more, maybe even 2,000. But if London lost 2 million people to the other cities, the smaller cities, 2 million makes no difference to London, maybe 20% drop. It just wouldn't really make that much difference. It would make a huge difference to all those other cities, which could absorb 100, 200,000 people each and upgrade their infrastructure. And that can only work if we've got better way of managing road space time. So for the first time probably ever, we've got an opportunity to migrate a large number of people to other places. That could save the economy in places like South Wales, which I know has a lot of challenges, which could be alleviated by more population growth.
So one of the things you've been advocating for years, though, is being paid not to drive, isn't it?
Yeah, and that I do believe that absolutely works. It's a simple case of how much do you value what you're doing, and rather than saying, well, why would you want to sit in a traffic jam when you could be at home, especially on a video conference, and you could have that extra money instead, and the extra time you've saved by not driving in. Just as Rory said on his first point, we have to look at what we're trying to incentivize when we say to people, oh, you're going to take X number of hours to go here. And there is a huge amount of value to get from knowing you have a very small variability in your journey time. For example, when I've gone to Paris, the same journey which takes 10 minutes one day can take 1 hour the next day. The variability is enormous. Whereas in London, because of congestion pricing, generally doesn't really change that much. If it's going to take you 20 minutes one day, it'll take you 20 minutes next day around the same time. So again, that's a huge win just on that basis. And if that can also be translated into real fiscal income for city governments especially, and therefore more generally region, I do believe that's transformative, not just for an advanced economy like the UK, but for other economies which haven't even started with a car yet. Think of some country like Central African Republic. If roads could be put in, which are financed by this model, they've now got a market to which we can export our excess car capacity, even with petrol engines or hybrids or whatever else. That's where I see this really going. That's COVID, as annoying as it has been. It's an even more amazing laboratory than September 11th was, in terms of when we could say, look what happens when there are no planes flying. This is how the environment reacts.
Yeah. So, Michael, how does this work, do you think, in terms of paying people not to drive? So you're paying people not to drive, you're paying people not to shop, you're paying people not to have their boiler service. In a time where we're looking at, I've just worked on a piece on the battle for curb space, and you're looking at how curb spaces now, like it's like the new gold, where you've got micro mobility operators using the curb. You've got obviously more and more people. You've got shops and restaurants and bars expanding their footprint into the curb space because of COVID restrictions. You've got autonomous delivery companies. You've got the manned delivery companies making more and more deliveries because of the same reason. All this kind of just makes, it's like a big melting pot of ideas, and somewhere someone's going to come out with this great idea that works for everybody. But how do we finance the idea of paying people not to drive their cars?
Well, I think a lot of this boils down to two things. In the old days, people used to talk about political economy. And these days, the two tend to be separated, that the politics and the economics are something inherently different. And I do think that you come to slightly different decisions based on the politics or the economics. So today's classic economic caricature is somebody who's broadly just concerned with the efficiency of things. And so many of these proposals are effectively computer simulations, Sim City of what you see the future holding with or without permanent COVID variations. So that's kind of one aspect of it. The political aspect is quite interesting, and I think boils down to what is your view of ownership. So are these a public resource? Is it really the states or the Queen's highway of some form? And therefore we as society are owed effectively by people who use it. Is it really related to the ownership of individuals who have automobiles and therefore have the right to use them? There's a lot that's coming out. I think what is interesting though is that the challenge to the traditional model of an individual in their own vehicle has risen as never before. You alluded to autonomous vehicles, rentals, vans, drones, which may need to come down these same corridors. So there's a tremendous amount of who owns this space. Is it public space or private space? If it's public space, is it a local authority's public space, a national public space, some type of city basis? So it's not an easy question, and I don't think there are going to be straight answers. The economics and the charging all have to follow those type of political decisions. And I'll give you an example where some of this really has some outrageous effects. So one, governments governments like to believe that they're technology neutral, and that the best technology will win. People in the markets like to assert that, to let it go onto the markets and we'll see who wins. But infrastructure is important. If I came up with some point-to-point system that was 4,000% more efficient, but required absolutely straight lines, and so I was talking about reorienting the entire road network in the country and demolishing houses, people would tell me what a fool I was. I have to live on the existing system that's there. So the government in this country decided to bring forward, rather remarkably, the move to non-fossil fuel vehicles. That sounds technology neutral. In reality, it means we probably don't have the time to develop hydrogen. So the battery-based vehicles, and battery-based vehicles come with some fairly obvious problems, weight issues, and also, of course, a huge amount of pollutants. Now, things can be done about recycling, expecting technology battery improvement. But looked at over a longer haul, many scientists would claim that hydrogen was a better solution. But by the time you've installed the network for batteries, you're not going to have time to reinstall another network for hydrogen. And so we've driven ourselves, to use that, up the route of batteries. And not a lot of that has actually got to do with the economics. That's got to do with a government that wants to be seen to have adopted a posture that it is pushing things harder and harder, when actually what it's doing is it's cutting off loads of options and avenues that might be far better.
Sure, thank you. Rory, where do you start with the idea of creating a sustainable future for our road network? I mean, it sounds great. And as a journalist, it's a fantastic headline and a great story, but what would be in that article? How would we do that?
One way you could start, of course, is that, and this is where politics and economics clash, the cost of a parking permit in central or central-ish London, an annual residence permit, it should not really be called a residence permit because it's really a voter's permit, which is why they're so goddamn cheap. Okay.
Mine's not cheap. Mine is £148 a year because
that's still cheap.
My car, cheapish. My car just about gets into the 224 grams of emissions. However, had it been 2 or 3 grams more, micrograms more, I would have been £314 to park somewhere near my house.
It's still, when you think about it, if you look at that as a monthly rent, it's a very, very low rent on effectively real estate, which is worth a six-figure sum, isn't it? It's worth £100,000, that space in front of your house. And one interesting notion was always that you charge people a lot more for parking permits, but then people who are genuine residents who don't request them receive a kind of rebate for freeing up space.
Okay.
I'm also, one thing I'm also intrigued by, which I think is a blind spot of economics, is that how you charge people for things has a major effect on the general assumption of economics is that a dollar of cost is perceived as a unit of disutility. It's a unit of pain, however you present it. And I'm very interested in how different modes of charging, for example, road pricing that's charged individually. So, as I said last time, I think everybody has a right to a certain amount of free road use. I think we should accept that because certain people make essential journeys. Perhaps if you're an essential worker, your allocation should go up significantly. No, just as under petrol rationing, my grandfather was a doctor in World War II, and you had a rather better petrol allowance than a salesman would.
Yeah.
But also, the psychology of pricing really interests me here because, as I might have mentioned before, we've never really introduced a new tax where there's a payback. So typically, most voters or most citizens have come to see any new charge introduced by government as yet another, assault on their wallet.
Yeah.
And we've never done anything where we say, no, the deal is you'll pay much more for this, but in return, you'll get this back. The congestion charge in London had an element of it in that they invested the money in improving public transit, but it was not a directly visible exchange. So there's that question. There's also the question of, as I said, non-linear pricing, where the cost of doing something becomes exorbitantly higher the more frequently you do it, what you might call a season ticket in reverse. That's a really interesting area to look at, that people have a certain right to a certain amount of road use, but if you're a disproportionately heavy user, then you pay, again, exponentially more. And then other things are, do you price things according to use, or, just an interesting theory, do you price road use as a kind of insurance model, which is, Eric very rightly pointed out that the thing that really matters with journey time isn't speed, it's variance. Mm-hmm. And we've got the engineering metrics we tend to use to justify transport investment, by the way, are very, very poorly correlated with human happiness or well-being or even efficiency. Because speed, although consumers, when you ask them, will often refer to it as quickly speed, it's actually low variance that we want in transport, much more than we want speed. It's predictability. And particularly, the minimization of downside disaster. Mm-hmm. This is why I always make my point in my book that I actually take the back road to Gatwick, not because it's faster. It isn't. The M25 is faster, but the chance of missing your flight is lower because you have more optionality and less chance of totally catastrophic bottleneck. And so, we need to get, first of all, we need to get better metrics, but we also need to experiment with what people will pay for. So an interesting way of looking at it would be, do you charge people when there's a traffic jam for moving into an express lane? Most people will find that objectionable for instinctive reasons. It's essentially seen as capitalizing on someone else's misfortune. On the other hand, if the day before you could kind of insure your journey for, let's say, 25% of the cost, and in the event that there was a bumper-to-bumper tailback on your journey, you were then allowed to use the express lane of the M25. I think people would just judge that completely differently, even though the economics of it would be more or less identical. So, there are a whole load of questions about this. I also look at the question of compensation. Let's say you live in the flight path of London's third runway, although I was joking to the Spectator saying we need to have a debate on whether Heathrow needs a second runway. as a mischievous question.
Yeah.
Or could it just make do with one? But one of the interesting things there is if you pay people a lump sum, they'll tend to frame it as a loss, and they'll think my house has dropped in value more than the compensation you've paid me. If you made it a recurring payment, people will view it very, very differently. And so I think understanding that psychology of fairness and understanding the metrics that economics doesn't understand. There's a wonderful neuroscientist called David Rock. He's a Kiwi, but he's based in New York. And he has this nice little mnemonic scarf. And it's 5 things that humans deeply care about, which economics doesn't even consider. And it stands for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And it's a very, one of the things we'll need before we do anything else is we need better metrics, and we need human metrics, not engineering metrics. Because until we do that, we'll always be optimizing the wrong thing.
Sure. Well, you mentioned that, you kind of mentioned in principle, high occupancy vehicle lanes. Of course, we have in the States, I've many times driven from somewhere to Dulles Airport in the US and driven in the HOT high occupancy toll lane, which is where you live with it. And there was a time when people were putting sort of shop dummies in the front seat of their car to get away with driving in on their own, because you need at least 2 or 3 people, depending on which it is. But we had that in the UK on the M4 going into London. There's a HOV lane for a while, but I mean, nothing sort of took off. I thought it was a great idea, and you hypothecate the revenue or whatever it goes into keeping the scheme going, as we discussed hypothecation in the last episode. But Michael, where do you stand on that? I mean, the idea of high occupancy. Sorry, I keep ignoring Eric. I don't mean to. The high occupancy vehicle idea of raising money to actually improve the network, thereby making it sustainable, which is what we're talking about.
Is that for Michael to respond to, or should I respond?
Well,
I do have a disreputable relative who did purchase some of those dolls. So.
Yeah, what do you think? What do you think of the principle of it? Is it a sustainable way of raising money?
I think the principle's frankly outdated. We've got better technology. A lot of these simple solutions were based at a time when we didn't have the technology to do the tracking. So much of life is actually about tracking what people do and say they're going to do and all that. I once believed something like 25 to 40% of the economy is about people tracking each other. All the accountants, all the lawyers, all of the inspectors, all of the safety issues, and a lot of interesting areas on that. But I would pick up on a couple of things. I think we've got to start looking at the technology, not just about the vehicles, but actually the technology of tracking and pricing. There's no one solution. We need to experiment with these solutions, and we need to evolve to a better system. And so the mechanics of that are very clearly having some type of tracking and tracing system, world-class, if we will, for transportation, because that's the basis on which you can then move forward. And I don't think any particular path that we can look at now is anything other than speculation. Try it. If it works, great, modify it. If it doesn't work, throw it out. But you need the same infrastructure to do the tracking and tracing and recording of the vehicle movements to move up. I think a few things too. I wholly agree with Rory on variance. Variance or volatility reduction is what I'm really seeking. And this is rarely taken into account when we look at traffic improvement. So for example, we often look at increased congestion or reduction in congestion, but that starts with the idea that congestion is okay anyway, because it's low variance. I know that I'm there. Well, actually what I'm really concerned about is that variance in time. We have tried a number of things. I think petrol taxes are reasonably good because they move in line effectively with your usage. Road taxes are poor. I've paid my road tax. I might as well get the most out of it that I can. I've never been a fan of the congestion charge. It's not a charge, it's a congestion tax. And I live about 300 yards from the London marker for that. And I can tell you the white vans and the taxis and the Ubers, once they've gone in once, they hover there and stay there because they've paid this fixed charge and they want to get the most that they can out of it. So it's kind of the wrong thing, and it doesn't encourage people to shift their hours to reduce congestion because it's got fixed times. It's a terrible, it's a great money-raising scheme, but it's built on the fact that London used to be very, very attractive to move into. I walked through the city yesterday, and I got news for you. It's not drawing in very much. So there. And I think the other thing that we're not looking at. Let me try a really radical thought to you. In some cases, maybe I should be charging you more for parking your car. This is a negative asset. You're taking a nice expensive piece of your own property, parking it on public space and not using it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, shouldn't it be something that's actually in use? You move in that direction, you could see something like zip cars and things, frankly, being paid to park almost to be available.
Yeah.
This is a good public use of the asset. You as a systems user or something would find this beneficial. We want you to be out there helping people to share assets, because that reduces wasted asset usage, if you might call it that. People often talk about the embedded carbon that comes in automobiles arriving, finally on your doorstep brand new. They often don't look at the embedded carbon that's wasted, because we don't really use the assets thoroughly, because we favor private usage.
Oh.
So these are all sorts of things we could play with, but they require a tracking and tracing system to do it, rather than saying I'm going to do something like I'm going to stand there on the side of the motorway counting passengers who are over the norm or in the wrong lane.
I think one of a few things we need to do is we need to get away from the idea that public transport means mass transport, because in a sense Uber Lux, it's okay, it's a very, very high-end version of Uber, but it is a form of public transportation in that it's essentially, I suppose, it's a shared good. And so, everybody's use of it subsidizes everybody else's use of it to some extent. And so we have got into this idea that as soon as anything becomes government provided, it must be mass transit. And I think, anomalous little experiments like the Heathrow pod system have a lot of promise, because the anthropologist, I'm not an anthropologist, but the anthropologist in me does acknowledge that in cars we also have certain forms of value. They're a form of storage, for example. If you go somewhere in a car, you essentially have a locker in the shape of a trunk or boot in which you can leave all your stuff. There's privacy, for example. There's, comfortable shelter from the elements. There's probably, actually, of course, post-COVID, there's also the question of being in your own isolated bubble to an extent. And I don't think those preferences are going to go away. I also think the preference around ownership, or if you reframe ownership as some sense of certainty, isn't going to go away. The idea that you can essentially use a car on a whim, we have to look at that and look at the deep psychological forces that mean that people value that. And we have to have a good think about it, because quite often I think, there's a sort of Maoist element to public transport people, where one, they tend to have an egalitarian mindset. I noticed that when the London riverboats proposed doing a kind of super luxury VIP version, which, by the way, made total sense to me, because if you're using the riverboat as a commuter, that's a daily thing, and you're price sensitive to a degree. Okay, if you've visited London as a tourist, that isn't actually a form of transportation; it's a cruise, and you might willingly pay 3 times as much just to have someone, bring you drinks at a linen tablecloth. Well, what the hell's wrong with that? Personally, it's sensible price discrimination. And so, there's the egalitarian component, which tends to drive public transport thinking. And there's also the kind of mass component. It comes from that Maoist idea that everybody should eat the same meal and all eat together, because a cooking pot that serves a community has a larger volume to surface area ratio, and therefore you can eat communally more efficiently than you can eat individually. And yeah, that's true, but we don't all want to eat each other's food, just give you much choice over diet. And so we do have to understand that maybe there's a kind of hair-shirtedness to the idea of public transport, which we have to lose.
Sure, yeah. Eric, what do you think? Because we've all mentioned ride sharing there, and we're all talking about sort of hypothecation and the idea of transport paying for itself. I mean, you've been advocating, as I said, of dividing up road space into road space time segments and selling it like sort of slices of pizza. Sorry, using pizza as an analogy is horrible, but I just had pizza on my mind there. But where do we take it from here then? How do we put these ideas we've been discussing,
I think,
all of which are great, how do we put them into practice? How can these actually be things that in 20 years' time people are talking about as actual products and actual services rather than ideas?
I think we could do them within 10 weeks. And I think there's another podcast. It was an interview Rory did with Reason, where he talks about club goods. For example, the idea of a club good is something that, as long as you're getting your use of it, you don't mind if somebody gets much more use of it. And these are non-rivalrous but excludable things that you can deal with, right? Now, that's what I guess a large-scale ride-sharing system can be, because you can still make use of it. You can still make use of the infrastructure, and you can make use of it by yourself at whichever time. And your use of it doesn't actually get people not being able to use it later. Okay, and it's not one thing that only benefits one group of people, it benefits everybody. The other thing is what broadband service providers do when a greedy user uses more than the supposed allocated bandwidth. They put data caps on, and this is the idea of a season ticket in reverse, which we mentioned right at the start, where you can actually say, okay, once you go past your 10 gig or whatever else for the month, it's going to be 5p per megabyte or whatever, and that's exactly what gift gap example does when you exceed your 10 gig allocation within your £10 charge. And the other thing is, if we have a transit exchange where you've sliced up the road space time, you will find it doesn't matter. You don't need to check how many people in the car, because you'll find that somebody will say, well, you know what, it's going to cost me £50 to go in. That's just the road space time cost. I'll need 4 of the people in my car to bring that down to a reasonable cost at certain time. So they put as many mannequins or shop dummies as they would to pay that 50 quid. The mannequin's not going to do it. So what happens is that's exactly the model which has been used in aerospace for a long time, air traffic control and airports. Airports price the very narrow corridors of access to cities, city airports and landing zones in exactly that way. And what you found was that had a pushback effect on the airline manufacturers, the aeroplane manufacturers and the airlines themselves, that they tried to get bigger and bigger aircraft with more and more people. And that was just 747 stretch version, that was the A380, in order to get as many people as possible into a specific amount of airspace time. We can do the same thing with roads, and that can actually take away the need to count how many people in the car, whatever else. It's just taken care of. You'll find that people will adapt the most reasonable and rational thing for what they want to do from the roads. So we have to look at club goods. We have to look at exponential pricing for exceeding a certain usage, and that may also fix that problem of, once you pay the congestion charge for London, which doesn't vary enough, I must say, then you just hover in the area and you'll still create congestion. Yeah. I was talking to somebody from the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure, and that's what they were saying. We still have a congestion problem. Sure, we got rid of a lot of the cars in the city centre by high parking prices, but in the rest of the area, we've still got congestion on the networks. It's not working out for people. People still need a car to get to where they want to go if they don't live near enough a railway station. All those things can be fixed in much the same way as airports and airlines did them. That's how I see it. And all these ideas that both Michael and Rory have said, ultimately, we need to be aware that if you do too much tracking, you're going to become like a version of the Soviet Union. So we need to obviously put in data protection there as well.
I'll tell you a very funny story, which my wife was working at the Victoria and Albert Museum when the whole question of museum pricing came in, and whether museums should be free or whether they should charge admission or voluntary donations. And there are a whole load of things around that, including whether you can reclaim VAT or not. It's a big issue. But there were some strange people who said, no, I don't want to have free museums, because if the museums are free, weirdly, the audience is actually less diverse, because big museum hounds go very, very frequently because it's free, but you can't use incentives to encourage less well-served groups to come along. So you can't say, actually to your school, we're going to make it free on Monday, for example. And so one of the things I dislike about really crude pricing forms is that the season ticket, for example, actually incentivizes bad behavior. You know, it was a major obstacle to flexible working, which is I paid for this damn thing. I want to get my 5 days. I actually have friends who say that when they travel in on a season ticket on an off-peak train, they feel they're being cheated, you know, because I've paid for the peak journey, so I'm damn well going to travel at, you know, 8 o'clock in the morning. And so something similar to replacing it, and actually COVID's an opportunity to do this, replacing kind of Transport for London pricing with a kind of Amazon Prime system, where obviously as a frequent Londoner, you can't pay as much per journey as a tourist would be willing to pay, okay? But at the same time, you should still pay something for every journey so that we still have an incentive mechanism available to nudge people to different times of day, to, you know, to nudge people to travel less, so that if you only come into London 3 days a week rather than 4, you should save some money thereby, you know, rather than it making no difference. So some sort of Amazon Prime system to replace, or, you know, the kind of season ticket. The other thing, of course, which is possible is you could also do road rationing with the speed limit on a smart motorway. I always just, you know, mischievously, I'm not a big libertarian, but the one thing I do miss is having, is speed cameras on the Westway did destroy one of life's great pleasures, which was coming home at 2 o'clock in the morning and welling it over the London rooftops at 85 miles an hour. There was nothing to touch it. In fact, there was something to touch it, which is when they built the Westway, and before it even had walls or barriers, so it was just a flat ribbon of tarmac, the chief architect took his E-Type Jag along it at 100 miles an hour to test the camber with no sidewalls, which must have been kind of unbelievably cool. But I've often thought, if I'm willing to drive and see my dad in Wales at 11 o'clock at night, I'm a bit of a night bird, why don't you make the 11 to 6 o'clock in the morning speed limit on motorways 85, and the peak time speed limit on motorways should be 45, 50? Because you probably could, I mean, 30, I think, is the maximal speed, isn't it? Now, the second thing you've got to do, by the way, is you've got to, this drives me nuts about smart motorways. They've spent millions on them. Now, I don't work in advertising, I have a vested interest here, but they should have spent a couple of million quid just telling people how they work. Okay, you know, and so the reason that's particularly important is, of course, there's a very counterintuitive element to the smart motorway, which is that people traveling at 30, 40, 50, a road with cars on it traveling at 40 or 50 is much more efficient than a road where people are traveling at 70, because of the necessary exponential increase in distance between cars when you reach higher speeds. Now, it seems completely counterintuitive to say drive slower, arrive sooner, but that's actually true, okay? And if they'd told people, look, there's a benefit to obeying these recommended speeds rather than speed limits, people would have seen them as advice rather than an imposed constraint. And I think behavior might have been quite different. And so educating people and using other mechanisms, not just the price mechanism, to encourage people to travel at different times seems to me perfectly possible.
Sure. I'm going to change the subject slightly back to vehicles. But I was interviewed about 2 years ago on where I saw the benefits of autonomous vehicles and what year I would predict that autonomous vehicles will become not only popular on our streets, but the most dominant form of transport. And I said, well, it's probably going to be, let's say 2070. Okay, let's just pluck the number out of the air. And they said, what's the benefit? So the benefit for that would be that my car will be stuck in traffic, but I won't be. Now, it was kind of a bit flippant. I got a bit in trouble with autonomous vehicle companies saying it was kind of making a mockery of it. But genuinely, that's what I think it is. If we're talking about congestion and relieving congestion,
I completely agree.
We'll have autonomous vehicles in traffic, and as Michael mentioned earlier on about electric vehicles, they actually cost more to produce than fuel-powered cars, but per unit. So there has to be a whole new way of thinking. We're going to discuss this in another episode.
And the marginal cost of use of an electric vehicle is actually tiny compared to in many countries, particularly those with a high fuel tax. But I mean, it's tiny. So that sunk cost problem, which is I've paid for it, so I'm going to damn well get my money back by using it.
Yes, exactly.
And you're absolutely right that in an autonomous vehicle, the streets will be entirely crammed with people playing bridge. Okay, or whatever it is people are going to do. Okay, so again, this problem that when you use your insensitivity to delay as the principal currency of road use, it is literally the most inefficient currency you could possibly use.
Yeah, no, I agree.
I think where this conversation is going is quite interesting because if you look at autonomous vehicles at scale, what you're really talking about is railways with rubber tires. That's really what they are. And there's a lot of good things perhaps in that. But what we're talking about is I spent a fair chunk of time in the 80s and wrote a few papers about strategic planning projects that I had done at British Rail in those days. And so I've seen the one extreme of the economics where we're trying to run an internal market on what were called infrastructure units, which were every little tiny piece of track that you were trying to cost charge. And it, you know, it kind of worked in its weird way. This is before the privatization issues. This is about actually managing a railway that was integrated. But what we're seeing here is I'm no fan of hypothecated taxes because there's no such thing. With a centralized government, the tax just disappears into the coffers. So, and when you watch people on Question Time, they're full of, why don't we tax this or why don't we tax that, as if one, the tax is in line with it, two, that it's actually going to achieve the benefit, and three, that before you can do anything, you need to tax it. Why don't you split the two? And what we've got is a pricing issue. What can we get out of our roadways in terms of income? What is the right pricing that leads to the right sort of behaviors that lead to great efficiencies? That's completely separate from the taxation element of it. And in both cases, we've been treating it terribly. When it comes to pricing, we've been extremely crude. We've been crude because we don't have the monitoring techniques to monitor it in the first place. So we basically say, if you go into London once, I can't tell if you went in or out and how many times you went in and out, how much time you spent. So what is just a flat price? We're also that way because our payment systems aren't particularly good. We're seeing the rise of things like embedded finance, where you could, in fact, kind of go in, that's 3 pennies, you come out at 7 pennies, you go back in and out. The problem at the moment is if you did that, the charge on each one of those transactions would be vastly in excess of the pennies. But that's changing, and that's changing much more rapidly than I think people appreciate. We're now getting down into micropayments, largely because of the Chinese, who are showing us that this is completely and totally doable. So that's the one bit, is the pricing. On the tax side, as I said earlier, we don't know what works, and it's in line with what we're trying to get out of the road. But taxes as well. Politicians love to sell taxes as simply as possible, and they also like them to be lump sum, because they don't want to remind you that you're being taxed all the time. And actually, you should be. If you want behavior change, you should be seeing prices, and you should be seeing taxes. Otherwise, you're lying. You're saying, I wish to use an economic mechanism to try and change behavior, but I won't tell you quite what you're getting paid or what you're paying. So both of those to me are there. And when we look at this, I come back to, I said, if I had one thing that I'd like people to focus on, and would be to forget all the stuff about that and focus on what system could you build that would track everything that you need to track. And one could take an argument that says, well, I'll do that on mobile phones, leaving aside the civil liberties on it. But if you want to drive a car on a road, stick your mobile phone in there with this app on it, and we can check that you're registered. We can check whether you're in the fast lane or slow lane, because that's what we decided to do this year. We can check that you're, in a space. And we could see some really interesting stuff we haven't spoken about. For instance, this is all about options, really. Variance or volatility. The flip side, you're really trying to price options. That's how you do it. It's the Black-Scholes equation. Well, of course, what's my option? Maybe I would like, going back to that variance, I want an option to leave at 8:15 tomorrow and get to my destination, but I might be late and I've got a bit of money. So I also want an option at 8:35 and another one at 9:03. And why can't I buy that? Okay, yeah. I let 2 of them go, and maybe the road's free. Maybe I can't resell it, but that's my problem. But we're not going to get there without sophisticated tracking mechanisms that you could sell me that space in the first place because you knew that it wouldn't be occupied. So I'm a big fan of it, but I think everybody's, not this crowd, which I think is quite erudite, but most of the people I talk to in transportation are all trying to come up with quick fixes, or they're trying to relay out the road network, but they're not talking about how am I going to track it.
You could, of course, create a parallel currency, so the currency doesn't have to be money.
Correct.
So I've often wondered if you created a kind of currency for the use of public goods, which was unconnected to earnings. In other words, it was an egalitarian currency. I called it the ZOG. I don't know why I called it the ZOG. But the idea would be, you could either be paid or pay zogs. So if you wanted your GP to visit you at home, it might cost you a zog, and everybody would have an allocation of zogs. Okay, but if you wanted to buy more, the purchase of an additional zog for your personal use will be proportionate to your earnings.
Yeah.
And the argument behind this is it's a currency where it contains the information of willingness to pay without conflating that with ability to pay.
I might take that further, though. I mean,
Okay.
my point about political economy here, where actually what we do is we have a lottery, and we got 65 million people. We've got X billions of zogs, and I get a whole bunch of zogs randomly. I've got ones at 4 in the morning. I'm never up at 4 in the morning, but I've got them, and I can hold them. I can transfer them to my doctor. Doctor, I really want you to see me. Here are the zogs you need to get to me. But actually, I don't have a car. I walk to the corner shop and a few other things. I sell my zogs, the ones I don't use. So, and that would be an inordinately fair way to do the whole darn thing.
And the irony is, we look at this idea. I mean, this is the great thing, isn't it? That I think it was Hayek who always regarded currency as a monopoly only because of technological limitations. So Hayek envisaged the fact that you'd have lots of competing exchangeable currencies. Right. And of course, we look at the idea as if it's bizarre, except of course, what's an airline frequent flyer program? It's a parallel currency. Actually, brands have been operating these things for decades now.
Well, I've participated in a lot of those and was also one of the 4 people involved in the creation originally of Air Miles. So I've been around the block on this. But the one thing I have noticed over the years is the minute you have a whole bunch of parallel currencies or any parallel currencies, people need to be able to exchange it and translate it back into one. And the one parallel currency that dominates, and this is you as the anthropologist, I've always said money is a technology communities use to exchange across debt across time and space. We have coercive communities. You belong to the British community whether you like it or not. Try and avoid paying your taxes. The state has a monopoly on the use of force in a specified geographic area, which is effectively Britain. Good. And the state, therefore, is the only person who can tax you, and the state issues tax credits. And I frequently find people don't understand what money is in the sense of fiat currency. It's a tax credit, and I can exchange that tax credit with you. And so long as the state is 40+% of the economy, that's going to be the dominant currency, and everything else is going to translate into it and out of it, whether you like it or not.
Okay, Eric. Final word to you. We have to wrap up.
Everything there.
Other things to go and do. Other interviews to go and do. So Eric, do you want to wrap up the what we've discovered this last hour?
That is exactly what our very first realization was going to be. That it's a set of call options. Exactly both what Rory Michael said. That you have a right to use the road at a certain time or a certain amount of road use, but like the allocation for that time, you buy a call option. Just you need more minutes. Like for example, say it's going to take 28 minutes to get from your home to wherever on the M62. You might buy half an hour of road space time usage, but you'd also buy call options to ensure you, in case you use more. A bit like if I got a bandwidth cap, I might buy an extra option to give me an extra 1 or 2 in case I go over the 10 gigabytes. So that's the whole idea. It's exactly as a call option. The other thing is, in terms of competing currencies, what we have is equity, competing currencies. Every can issue its own currency and say, please buy my currency. Until we are allowed to pay for anything other than the fiat. Oh, I'm sorry.
You're breaking up.
Sorry, guys.
You're breaking up.
What's happened is that's my bandwidth cap has gone. I'll call this separately. I'll have to send it separate out, ironically.
Yeah, you go for it. I'll bring you back later. We'll do it later.
We need an internet bandwidth pricing currency, I can tell.
And not be with GiveGaff. Funny, you give GiveGaff a free advert and then your minutes go. Okay, right. I'll come back and pretend that we can do that later on. My friend Nick will edit this. So Nick, can you get rid of this bit and then we'll do it later on. Okay, so I will wrap up then because we're going to talk about, we've done now, but we'll have episode 2B, we'll continue the discussion, but I'll wrap up.
Also be really clear what you're selling, by the way, which is that we tend to have a very crude idea of transportation as though it's simply sort of a distance time equation. And a fascinating example of this was it took quite a long time. In fact, it started in Africa before it happened in Europe for mobile phone companies to offer pay-as-you-go tariffs rather than a contract. And the reason it was necessary in Africa is there are a lot of people who weren't credit worthy, there are a lot of people who are unbanked, etc., etc. So they did it out of necessity. And everywhere they did it, they discovered the same thing, that actually a huge number of people who are on pay-as-you-go would have been better off with a tariff, okay? And that sounds, they would have been better off essentially on paying a monthly subscription. And that makes no sense to a lot of people. And that was why they were so terrified of offering pay-as-you-go, because they said 2 million people will buy a mobile phone which is subsidized, keep it in the glove compartment of their car, and they'll only use it if they break down. That was their great fear. Never happened. Well, it did happen, but it was a tiny number of people. My dad, okay, principally. The interesting thing there is, of course, people are paying for autonomy. And so we do need much, but what they were paying for is, in a sense, they were paying a premium for the fact that they weren't committed. And so understanding what people really want and what people will pay for, rather than using transport as a sort of a branch of geometry, I think is really essential to the understanding of this going forward, because that will prove the best way to price. You'll actually discover that different people want different things. And whenever we buy anything, we're never really buying the thing. I always joke about this, that the reason you buy a swimming pool isn't because you want to swim in it, it's because it allows you to walk around your garden in the summer in a bathing costume without feeling like an idiot, so there are always these, these deeper needs, and we haven't really dug deep enough into the real why of travel. A huge amount of it is, I have to say, a huge amount of leisure travel is fatuous signaling, which is that my brother was in a hotel room once in Singapore, and they had a competition, the local TV station, and it was second prize was 2 weeks in Bali, first prize was a week in London. Of course, my brother burst out laughing. And you do have this undoubted phenomenon that people are taking long haul trips to fairly obscure destinations for bragging rights.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
I don't know if you're a fan of Robert H. Frank, who's a brilliant kind of Darwinian psychologist, but we do have to watch these signaling problems. As I said, a huge amount of business travel was a performative act. It was costly signaling, which is, I care so much about you, Jürgen. I got up at 6 o'clock this morning and traveled out to Frankfurt. The whole thing could be done on video. I don't make the same judgment about those business trips I took that lasted 4 or 5 days where I got to know a different place. That had a wider value. But an enormous amount of this stuff is utterly performative. And then, of course, the complicated thing we now have is that we're starting to form Zoom-based networks of business rather than transport-based networks. And, I had a meeting earlier today with 3 people in the United States, but one was in Wisconsin, one was in Atlanta, and the other one was in Florida. Okay. And so actually transport won't even be, when this whole thing ends, if it does, a transport network is totally unfit to, reunifying those people anyway.
Yeah. You're right.
So I mean that's created some really strange network kind of effects, in that we never pointed that out enough, I think, which is that one of the reasons for megacities is that air travel is a hub and spoke form of travel. Okay. So one of the reasons why you've got these megacities is that if you looked at